Hi, friends. I'm Heather Miller, CEO and founder of social impact startup Grasshopper, talent acquisition and DEI specialist, mom of 2 humans and 3 fur babies, most under 4, former professional ballet and hip hop dancer, yoga teacher, interior designer, caregiver, provider, retirement planner, innovator, social connector, and the list goes on. As you can tell from my bio, I've always taken drive to the extreme, and for the most part, done pretty well juggling all of my hats. However, I say this on behalf of most of us, the past 3 years have been very challenging. My personal experience included moving to an unknown city, the unexpected death of my mother, and the birth of my first child 2 weeks later, launching a startup during maternity leave, the pandemic, building diversity strategies for a global corporation in the wake of George Floyd's death, another baby, and then, the icing on the cake, a layoff. I felt like I was approaching a midlife crisis with no space to do so. As a result, I've been thinking about balance and whether that's actually a thing. Join me as I speak with some amazing thought leaders and women in my life to understand how they keep the fire going and the lights on while staying sane. We'll explore drive, juggling priorities, taking no prisoners with your schedule, love and sickness, pursuing your dreams, enjoying the journey, and figuring out what is right for you. We hope these conversations help you err on the side of midlife epiphany versus midlife crisis. Welcome to Balancedness. Kevin, thank you so much for being here at Balancedness.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Heather.
I'm so excited to chat with you. We met through Sidebar.
Sure.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with Sidebar, it is, I would say, a professional development platform and community. Is that what you would say it is?
Yeah,
For executives and startups, and they do really cool things with group cohort coaching. Yep. And so you and I got to meet because we're both local to Austin.
Yes.
And what I remember from meeting you at first is, number one, that you have a very entrepreneurial spirit. Mm-hmm. But also I was really impressed with your reading list.
Yeah.
And not just your reading list, but also the details that you retain from the reading list. So you're one of those people who can like pull a quote out of their back pockets, which is something that's definitely not my strength. I'm like a big picture kind of person and remember our high level concepts, but and we'll get more into this, why you are a detailed person, but it was really cool.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. I have a methodology typically behind something, so.
Yeah, I'm learning that this week. So could you please introduce yourself to the community? And since we're talking about balance, include all parts of you.
Sure. I'll start. Yeah, Kevin Noble. I live here in Austin, Texas. I have a master's degree in mechanical engineering. I started my professional life in the automotive industry at Ford Motor Company. I was so into cars. I even volunteered for a race team, Grand Am Cup, traveled around the United States, even went a little bit international. I was on the pit crew. That was really fun. But I know we'll talk about maybe my journey later. I'll just jump to the end where right now I'm a strategic advisor to the customer support services org at Atlassian, where I've been for nearly 10 years. Outside of professional life, I love being a dad. I've got a great wife, 3 kids. I've got 2 rescued pit bulls who are also really awesome. You mentioned I love to read. I do read a ton. It's mostly nonfiction, and I've done so daily for years and years. I'm also a writer. I have a weekly newsletter called The Catalyst, which is about growing yourself as a leader. I also love nature. I really prefer being outside in the open air, given the choice. I like to challenge myself. So physically, that's a lot of exercising, rucking, running, weightlifting, obstacle course racing, just things to push myself and go beyond my boundaries. But I also love to cook. I'm in the kitchen every day, and I make a mean margarita. Those are my things.
Wow, Renaissance man, that is so cool. So what do you think about balance? What does it look like for you?
Yeah, I do think about balance. I like operating in the gray, and to me, that's balance is where things are in tension. There's not really a black and white, and balance is about finding that sweet spot between different opposing forces. I also think about balance occurs on time scales, so it could be in the moment, or the day you're thinking about balance. It could also be about seasons. So I think about for me when my kids are little, it took a lot out of me to make sure they were on a good path. There wasn't as much time for some of the other pursuits. So, balance then looked different than when I zoom out and I think about balance for my life or now that I'm, beyond where they need me as much. And so balance to me though is that tension between different forces and kind of being mindful of how to find the sweet spot between them.
I really like that idea of seasons, and as a parent to two toddlers, it's very helpful to hear that. I keep thinking this too shall pass when they're in a terrible phase, but also a phase where I don't get to indulge in the things that fill my cup. So it's really helpful to hear that perspective. So thank you.
Yeah.
Tell us about your early career trajectory from mechanical engineering to strategic advisory.
Yeah, I've had a sawtooth career is how I describe it. So, I grow in my role, then reinvent myself in a new industry, new type of work, take a step back. Then I grow even higher in that next role, do the same thing. I've had the pleasure of working across a lot of industries and functions, so hardware and software. I've been in all sorts of different industries, SaaS, automotive manufacturing, you name it. I would say the three things that were consistent through all that is, I hold myself accountable, I consistently improve, and I solve problems. But going into the actual details of your question there, yeah, I started in mechanical engineering. And after a few years there, I realized that I had other interests I wanted to pursue. So kind of alluding to balance, I felt like the balance was off in my career. And what I did was I moved to Texas. I won't bore you with the methodological process that my wife and I used to find where we were going to live, but Austin won the lottery, so to speak. And when I came here, what I did was I wrote a letter to a computer manufacturing company, a very small company, but it was for a sales role. So I left automotive mechanical engineering and came to Texas to do a sales role. And I wrote them and said, hey, I believe I can do this job despite obviously having zero experience. And if for some reason it doesn't work out, I could always start a new engineering function for you. Since this was computer manufacturing, I was like, I could make some custom enclosures for your customers. They hired me. I guess they liked the pitch that I made. So I did sales. I was on the phone with customers. I was specing out computers, and includes like individual people at their house, but also companies that wanted to make bigger orders. But I'd sell something and maybe the product would get late or there was a quality issue. And so I spent a lot of time in the manufacturing area just because of my background. I wanted to prevent those issues from happening. I didn't like telling the customers that it was wrong or late. And so I started going back there and introducing like Six Sigma manufacturing concepts, other quality concepts. And within 6 months, the CEO took me out to lunch and he asked if I would run the entire manufacturing area. And so I was 27. I'd been there 6 months. I suddenly was leading 22 people, first time leader. They'd been with the company, some of them for a couple of decades. And so fun experience. I ran that team for years. The company went out of business in 2010. I actually had just had my oldest son was just born 6 weeks prior to shuttering that company. So that was always interesting. But for my next role, I guess that in retrospect, it was kind of the same play. I reached out to a company that had contracted that company to do some work. I wrote them a letter and I talked about the things that I could do. And I applied to a specific role, which was a shipping clerk. So again, something brand new and definitely a step back. But the people hired me. They knew I was overqualified, but they thought they could take a chance on me. And similarly to the other role, within 5 months, I started absorbing some teams and some scope. Again, just very dedicated, thorough, solve problems. And so they asked me to take on additional scope. By the end, I was a VP and ran everything in that company that had to do with the hardware and controls. So that's global manufacturing, it's on-site installation, it's vendor selection, procurement, a lot of different things. But did that for a couple of years and realized that I'd stopped growing, which is a theme for me. It was something I learned at Ford where, again, that the balance wasn't there. I can do a job, but I also like to get better at the job and expand the things I can do. And that wasn't there for me anymore. So I reached out to a company called Atlassian. They had a role that was called Reporting and Analytics Program Manager. I've never been in SaaS. I don't have a background in pure analytics, but I, do know how to do math. So they took a chance on me, and I started running a team of 2 analysts. Similar story. Within about 6 months, started hiring some new functions. We hired data engineers at first, and then over time started absorbing different related teams. And so at the end, eventually, I was the head of business transformation for the customer support services department. And to simplify it, it's essentially all the functions that are not part of being on the queue, as we say. So this is kind of data science, data engineering, some developers, program management, business architecture, and so on. Eventually I had 135 people across the globe doing that work. But this was not in balance, honestly, at the end. That dimension was, this is 10-hour days for a long period of time. Sometimes longer. I had to travel several times a year. Before COVID, I would have sometimes 12 trips a year, and these are international. It was a very heavy burden. Had very little time and energy left for my family or any other kind of pursuits. Body under a lot of stress. I also realized my entire network was Atlassian because I'd been there for so long that was like the trigger that things were out of balance. So last year is when I pivoted into the role of strategic advisor. It's the latest, I would say, in that sawtooth career, going back into an IC role. And what it does, though, is it gives me more time to do what I'm uniquely qualified to do, which is solve hard problems. And so instead of having a team and all these things that are part of how to be successful, my job is to just take the really hard problems, get those framed so that we can get those executed on. It's really fun. And it does give me more balance, but we can talk about that too. So I'll stop there. That brings us to the modern moment.
Yeah. So you've got a laundry list of external pursuits and things going on that you just mentioned. So, your passion for writing and developing leaders, a really structured way of networking, a large family, the 2 dogs. How do you balance the 9 to 5 and let's just call it the 5 to 9?
Yeah, lots of deep breaths, I would say, is kind of the number one. I would say a lot of mindset work, because to your point, a lot of it is not under my control. So the life I live with the kids and the sports and my wife's career, it means that there's not a predictable kind of method, which again, as an engineer, is something I've had to come to learn to be comfortable with and some adapting techniques. So I'd say there's a lot of mindset work. It means I do squeeze things in when I can, but I don't get mad if it doesn't work out. Having a plan, and then if life happens, then just take a deep breath, be present, and adjust. I also try to do a lot of time box planning, though. So setting an intention and knowing, okay, we're a calendar heavy family, given how many people are doing so many different things. So putting it on the family calendar on Sunday, it takes me about 5 hours to write my newsletter, so that gets plopped in. It's obvious if there's going to be a soccer game or 3 that interfere with that, and I have to adjust. So time box planning and putting it on the calendar helps me find space. I also have a budget for those major activities. So, I want to do this many hours of writing. I want to do this many hours of networking. I want to do this many hours of other things. And, being able to see how that kind of fits into the Tetris of life. And then it kind of gives me confidence when I'm going through. It's like, I do have time for this. I have budgeted it. I understand how it works. I can set on a different day, it's kind of, I do this on Tuesday, this on Wednesday, this on Thursday. So all of that pre-planning, again, with the deep breaths and the adjustments when things go off. But let's see, I do like to set goals. So same thing kind of at my work, but I like to reflect on and set goals and then kind of break it down into, okay, if my goal, which is something I can't control, is out there in the future, what are the things that are in my control that I can do that make it more likely to get to that future state? And then those turn into habits. And so being able to think about how I think about my future, what can I control? And then what are the day-to-day habits that I need to do to, again, just, they say success is a lagging indicator. And so how do I just do the work every day and kind of build toward that future thing? So I'll pause there. Let me know if you want to dive.
There's so many things coming out of this. I love the idea of time boxing. I try to do that. I do it for myself, though. I love that you make it public so the whole family is aware, because I find that there is conflict when someone has an expectation that's different than yours. So that's really smart. And when you said budget, I was originally thinking that you meant a financial budget for your activities, which is smart, but you mean more a time budget.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just thinking about being mindful of that. And it's nice to do that also for those with a partner to be able to say out loud, like, these are the things that are important to me. This is how long it takes. You can kind of co-create a life that allows your partner's interests and desires to kind of go in there. And, because the good thing is that the week is constrained. It's not like that's a variable. So you can kind of look ahead and say, well, there's this many weekdays, this many weekend days. How can you set it in? Because again, have learned over the years that if you don't do that, that's when a lot of conflict arises. You have some unspoken needs or interests, and then you get frustrated, but you never stated out loud, and you didn't kind of solve in advance. So those are the lessons learned, I guess, over time.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. Um, you talked about you mentioned your wife and the family schedule a little bit. So I want to circle back to this because, and I found this so fascinating when we met, that your wife is a midwife. And so that obviously is going to impact your schedule and um not only your schedule, but the family schedule, and a lot of things are up in the air. So how do you cope with the ambiguity of the family schedule and a member being on call?
Yeah, because I'm essentially on call, in a manner of speaking. And it's funny, it happened earlier this week where I woke up and my wife was gone, and I was like, you go through the motions, you're like, oh, okay, this morning is going to be different, and so I have to think through, okay, when she's gone, I'm responsible for this. I have to look at my work calendar because obviously school drop off and pickup is during working hours, so I have to look for conflicts, and do that. But yeah, so it comes up a lot. Some of the coping is, like I said, I guess put on my calendar different time blocks when I know that there's a potential conflict. I think I call it a scheduling risk zone on my calendar. And so it's a signal to both me and anyone who wants to schedule a meeting that we can schedule it this time here, but if my wife gets called, then I'm going to have to reschedule. And so I have it on there, and it just, I try to avoid scheduling if I can, but if the inevitable happens, then at least I've tried to signal in advance, and then it's just clear to me what I need to adjust. But yeah, I guess just roll with the punches and put a plan in place, and then you can just enact it when the day arrives.
I like the transparency of that risk zone. So other people are aware of what's going on with you, makes it a little bit more personal, and then they understand if there's a need for rescheduling. That's really
Yeah.
smart. I want to talk about parental influence on career and money. How did the polarity of your parents' perspectives on money and career shape your thoughts around these?
Yeah. Uh, Yeah, my parents are divorced. They divorced when I was young, and they're very different people. I would say some of what I learned, of course, was explicit, but a lot of it was just implied by how they lived. My earliest years, we were quite poor. I grew up on a farm in Michigan. Neither of my parents graduated from college, and I'm sure that environment, of course, influenced how they each think. I would say that my mom's influence was more, make money so that you can enjoy life. My dad's influence was a little more enjoy your job so that money doesn't matter as much. And I've had to figure out how to thread the needle maybe between both of those perspectives. I'm sure my parents would agree that there is a way to combine both. Find something that you love that also pays well. But I started in engineering in part because I did love it. I've always been kind of a hands-on physical person. I was in, what is it, middle school and high school, and doing those. I was gravitated towards those kind of projects. So it felt like a natural evolution to go into college and then professionally. But it was a good starting career. It was good money, engineers, lawyers, doctors, that kind of classic, I guess, thing. But as I mentioned earlier, a few years into Ford, I realized I didn't love it. I enjoyed it. There were aspects of it that were good, but I really wasn't spending my evenings, I don't know, getting better at core engineering. I wasn't cracking open textbooks and pursuing deeper things. And I realized I had some other interests that needed to be in balance. And so I've made some adjustments as I've gone, and each new role, of course, I kind of grow. The thing that's consistent there is I am finding what drives me through this. And I know you mentioned books earlier, so I guess I can't help making my first book drop here, but Robert Greene has a book called Mastery that I think is really good for anyone who's interested in thinking about kind of what they were uniquely put on this earth to go do. And it's just a really helpful framing. And so for me, that's around being okay that doesn't happen overnight. You don't find your life's purpose, and you don't put yourself in a career that, you can just snap your fingers and do. You just have to reflect and make adjustments as you go. So you're in a career. Do you love it? You know, is it really what you love? And usually the answer is not 100%. Although there's some rare folks that I'm sure among us who just happen to come across it, but for the rest of us, you know, it's not going to be perfect. Being able to then reflect on the fear that might be getting in your way, and there is a lot of fear. It's hard to transition from something into the unknown, but I've done it several times, and every time it kind of worked out. There's a lot of luck involved, but I think we fear things more in the abstract than in the practical. And so usually you can kind of work your way through, but I know maybe I'm going off on a tangent here from the parents, but you know, I've just had to take their influence and figure out my own version of it. And what it looks like for me is kind of those reflections and saying like, do I really love it? Does this give me energy? Is this what I was meant to do here? If not, how do I continue to kind of tweak and adjust what makes me uniquely me? And how does that then provide value for people out in the world?
So I have a very similar background in that my parents had very different ways of looking at career and money. My mother was a trained teacher, but she was a stay-at-home mom, and I guess there were some drawbacks to that. And so she wanted, you know, she had two girls, my sister and I, and wanted us to be self-sustainable. So she really, really pushed career and money. My father, who comes from a very poor background, became a doctor. So, you know, he had money as an adult. And so I think his focus has always really been on passion. So for
Yes.
us, it was like, you know, do the fashion design, be a graphic designer. So I've always struggled with that. I've really flip-flopped. And I don't have a process for integrating. So you just talked about asking yourself a set of questions about what fulfills you, what are you good at, what are your strengths and flows, but then how does money come into that equation?
Yeah. Let me think. I know you and I have talked about stoicism, I think, here and there, and there is a concept called premeditatio malorum. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but it's the premeditation of evils. And I'm thinking about that because there's some examples of Stoics throughout history and modern people where you practice the thing you're afraid of. In this case, with money, it'd be kind of being poor or destitute or having a lower income. And you can kind of practice it. And just like earlier, where the fears maybe are bigger in your head than in reality, but you can kind of practice what it looks like to be that way. And so I think I've also let go of some of the fears related to money. And I am aware that the way you feel about money is kind of independent than the money you might have. And that there are people that can be very happy at a certain income level and other people are unhappy at that level. And then you could look at really, let's say, rich folks, and you find people that are unhappy and so they're related, but not purely correlated. And so I think for me, it's being aware that there are certain work that are valued in the market more than others. And you don't have to sacrifice one or the other. Maybe I'm not making my point very well, but it's like, I'm not unaware that the market values my skills in a different way than maybe others that I might pursue. Cause like, I like, I don't know, I like drawing, I guess, but I'm not pursuing that as a career. It's just a thing that I'm into and I can incorporate it into my work. But I'm aware that that wouldn't necessarily be a very kind of monetarily beneficial way to work. And so, whereas some of the other things around strategy or operations are more highly compensated, and I do like them, I don't know. So kind of keeping those things in balance and not being unaware of it. And so don't be so, I guess, purely focused on your passion that you ignore the fact that you know, I will admit nicer to make more money. Like I've been poor and I guess I prefer not. And so you know, anyway, like try and balance those things.
Yeah, it comes back to balance.
Yeah.
Thanks for that insight. We've talked about the experiments that you do, and I've read about some of these in your newsletters as well. So, two examples, and I would love to hear more examples as well. But you said no coffee, no alcohol. How do these help you test the parameters of balance?
Yeah. So if balance is a tension between forces, then I find it helpful to push against the balance just to see what happens. And so the removal of coffee and alcohol, which is somewhat of a recent experiment for me, is just testing that where, I had inertia. It's like I was drinking 2 cups of coffee a day, and every day you just do that because that's what you do. And it almost became mindless. I wasn't as intentional about it. And so I just got curious about what it would be like to remove that. And does that change my life in any way that I like? And if I don't, then I can go back. I could do 3 cups now if I felt like it, or I could do one. But you kind of have to break those barriers to then retest how things feel. And so alcohol was the same thing, where it's like, okay, I drink a margarita with my wife on Friday. I mentioned me margarita, so that's part of our ritual. Friday night, I'll make her a margarita myself, and then I got curious. Like I'm aware that alcohol doesn't necessarily like make me feel great, and so I got curious if I removed it entirely, how would I feel? I would say the bad news for me is that I do feel better with both of these removed, but so I'll see if I bring these back. Because I think it was 2012, I did a similar experiment with soda. I was like, I'm gonna go a month and see if I can go without soda. And then a month became forever. I just decided that I felt better without it. And so sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. But the experiments are all about like resetting those forces to see if that can kind of shake something loose and teach me something about how I'd like to live my life, which allows me to live it with more intention than just being on autopilot.
So it's less about diagnosing a problem, it's more about curiosity and growth paths from there.
It can be like, because the problem with alcohol was sleep, it was very acutely aware. Okay, you drink a margarita with your wife on Friday, and then on Saturday you don't feel so great. And so I was like, okay, there's a very obvious the relationship here. And so I'll test those. So sometimes they are curiosities, just I'll become aware that I'm doing something. And I do like to ask myself, why am I doing that? That's kind of a pattern for me. And sometimes those curiosities fizzle, I was curious and then okay, and then I move on. And then other times I'm like, actually now I am really curious and what would happen, and those become those little experiments.
Very cool. I want to talk about the tension and balance as it relates to our day to day. For someone who experiences anxiety and depression, like many of us do, what are the optimal components of a day that help minimize those feelings of anxiety and depression or whatever anyone is struggling with?
Yeah, so I'd say like first, to me it's all about exercise, meditation, and food. Like all of those things have a big impact, and you don't realize again until you test. So for food, I have removed other things from my diet, and then kids have a party, they make a request that I make something, I make it, and then I wake up the next morning and I'm like, I feel so depressed, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, that's because I ate that thing last night. So it's funny that those things affect it so much, but they do. So that's something I think about. But when I go outside of that, going into the day, again, I mentioned reflecting, and I like to do that both at the daily level. Okay, I had a great day. What made today great? And I can kind of think back and the things I'm grateful for. I can think about the things that I did, and if you do that day over day, reflecting on good and bad, you do start to see patterns that emerge. You're like, man, I love being outside. That's a thing that you discover when you're like, I had a great day today. And you're like, oh, I went on a hike with my whole family. And so then you have the kind of connection element of being with people you love, and then you have nature. And if you say that to yourself a couple of times, or if it seems like that's correlated with positive feelings, you're like, okay, that's a keeper. I want to make sure that we incorporate more of that. And then for the things that, aren't working, and if you see a pattern there, those maybe become the experiments. Like, okay, alcohol seems to contribute to not feeling great. I can remove those, but those daily reflections to identify patterns are really helpful. I also do those annually. And so at the end of the year, I've got a template and a process, Heather, that I go through to ask myself some questions. I've done that for several years. To helpful exercise to again clarify goals and figure out, where am I trying to go? I don't make it a rigid process, even though it sounds like it. It's just like, where do I want to be? What does the future look like? Where do I think I would like to be? Then again, working backwards and figuring out again, like what day, what month, what week, what do I want to change? And at the end of all that, I'll just say for me, for Kevin Noble, for a day, I know that if I'm doing exercise and movement, if I have connection with people I love, if I have nature, if I'm making progress on my goals, if I'm kind of meditating and exercising my brain, so to speak, and then interspersing little bits of relaxation, that's actually a really good day for me.
You just mentioned this template, and I'm really curious for some of us who are not as organized as you. I do a lot of reflection. I create a lot of lists, but then it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. What's your best advice for templating or getting things in one place?
It's the remembering that it comes back to habits, or at least that does for me. I'll say that would be my advice is, taking the reflection and turning it into an action. And so they're connected to me. And so when I do the reflection at the bottom of the list, it's not just how was the year and how did things go and who helped give you energy and who drained energy. It goes down to the bottom and it's like, and now what are you going to do? So are there things, commitments that I need to cancel? Do I need to back out of things? Do I need to add things? And so I would say for me, it's just remembering that it needs to drive behavior change. And for me, behavior change starts with habits. And so reflecting on the habits I want to adjust has been a real game changer for me.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So last question here is, what's your best advice for someone looking to strike a balance?
Yeah. Test your limits. I would say do something a lot less, do something a lot more. You'll be surprised how anti-fragile and elastic you are. And so being able to push on things and really test your limits. I also think that builds confidence. So there's a lot of good things to it, but I do like testing limits. I would also say do what you're doing. You might have heard that before, but a lot of us are at work thinking about home, or we're home thinking about work. You're washing the dishes, but you're actually arguing with someone that you talked to earlier that day. Your suit. So what happens is everything kind of munges together. So you might have balance at a high level, but if your brain and your body aren't doing the same thing, then it doesn't feel like balance. It feels like everything's kind of mixed. And so I think for me, especially, we mentioned my schedule can get kind of blown up. You have to like disconnect yourself from whatever was happening before and be present in the thing you're doing. So if my kids want to play basketball and I'm like, okay, I have a few minutes, let me go play basketball, being really present, playing basketball for 5 minutes, even though I might have a big meeting coming up that I need to be ready for, I try not to let those things mingle with each other. And it helps me at the end of the day. It's like, oh yeah, I had this time when I was playing basketball, because if I let it mingle, I almost am not there. It's like it didn't happen. And so if I'm doing what I'm doing, which again is not the reason I have to say that, is I have to remind myself to do that. I'm not perfect at doing it, but if I ever find myself distracted, just remember like doing what you're doing. Because again, I think it's not about creating new kinds of balance. It's just honoring the balance that is there and making sure the things that I have set up are remembered and present. I think the last thing, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's that the way that you just explained being in the now or being present resonates way more than any book on it that I've ever read. Connecting the mind and the body and doing what you're doing. The first seemed really ambiguous to me, and this felt really tactical. Like, connect the mind and body. It's that simple. Do what you're doing.
Yep. Well, thank you. Yeah, I find it helpful. The last thing I was going to say was interrogating your thinking. So metacognition, I think about the model of, you kind of react to things. There's an involuntary reaction. Of course, there's the loud noise and you kind of startle. But above that is some intentional doing. And then you have thinking, and then you have thinking about your thinking. And it's just a model, and you can kind of recognize where you are in all of those. So kind of doing what you're doing connects to the doing layer. It's like, I'm doing the dishes, so I'm going to do the dishes. But inevitably, your brain goes into thinking. And some people, and I mean, good and bad at this, I go up into thinking about my thinking a lot. But connecting earlier to anxiety and depression, like a lot of that stems from being disconnected from the doing, and you're going up those other layers. And so it helps to bring yourself down to doing. But also, not everyone goes up into thinking about their thinking. And a lot of time it's our thinking that gets us feeling out of balance, or we're getting a little bit wrapped up in things. And so if you can kind of go one layer above, because that's needed to retrain how you think, and thinking is how you retrain what you're doing. Being able to flexibly go up and down that at will is really helpful to say, oh, I'm thinking about my thinking, but I don't want to be here. I need to come down into playing basketball again. Or if you're doing something, you're like, I don't like what I'm doing. I don't think this is healthy for me anymore. You can kind of go up into thinking and think about thinking. So it's just helpful to be aware of and navigate that. I think that's helpful for me for finding balance.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're gonna play a quick game. It's called Yin or Yang. It's kind of a would you rather. Reading or writing?
Reading.
Nights out with the kids or movie night in?
Movie night in.
And finally, and I just learned this term, rucking or weightlifting?
Ah, man. I'll go with rucking. I answered quickly on the other ones because I tried to just let my body and that one felt tougher, but I think I'll go with rucking.
Okay, and for those of us who aren't really familiar, you said walking with weights.
Yes. So I think the term, this is I'm not an expert. I believe rucking comes from the military and the act of having to be able to like put a lot of weight on and walk. It's just a very good exercise for bone strength and stability and other things. And it's a very also low impact. So running, maybe it's bad on your joints, but just putting on a heavy weight and walking, it's actually quite good for your body. So that's what rucking is.
I've been doing arm weights and leg weights as I do my morning run or walk with my dog. Does that count?
Yeah, for me it does.
For you?
Load bearing thing. When I first started, I literally took a backpack and put textbooks in it, and I just walked around with that. They have, of course, more gear, and you can get all sorts of stuff. But yeah, just any kind of weight is really helpful for your body. So absolutely.
And can you can obviously target different areas, or is the idea just like overall load bearing?
It's just heavy. It's just really heavy, and you have to maneuver with that and keep your back straight. Because you'll find it's like, again, it goes back to testing your limits a little bit, where it's not clear when your gait or your posture is off until you try to do something load bearing with that same thing. So sitting here, I can be in all sorts of goofy shapes. But if I tried to lift something, I have to reorient myself. And so by kind of testing your limits with a heavy weight, it helps you realize weird things that you don't even know that you're doing with your body. So I think just a heavy weight just helps you reorient in certain ways.
Fascinating. I'm going to look more into it, and I might come ruck with you one day.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, always welcome.
Well, cool. Thank you so much for being here. I love chatting with you, and I know our community will as well.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Heather, so much.
Thank you for supporting another episode of Grasshopper's Balancedness podcast. If you liked it, please rate, review, and subscribe on our Apple and Spotify pages. Send me a screenshot at hello@grasshopper.com. That's GRASSHOPPHER to enter yourself into this episode's surprise raffle. And be the first to hear about upcoming episodes and events by signing up for Grasshopper's newsletter, which can be found on our website. Happy balancing until the next